When someone says your work is beautiful, say thank you and shut up. Hey everyone, Alex here. Welcome to another edition of the Bandsaw Life. Now today I want to show you how I make a shaker box. Now I thought it's a piece of veneer, you bend it, you tack it, it's pretty easy to do. I could not have been more wrong. These are not the most complicated box, but it does take some certain skills that you're really gonna have to put to the test in order to make these. Now, when it comes to making the sheets of veneer, that was pretty easy. I'm pretty good with the bandsaw, and I can strip that down so that I can take it to the drum sander and sand it down to a 1/16 of an inch. You're not gonna be able to make these without a drum sander. So, I will show you the process that I go through in order to make these boxes. That was an easy part for me. It may not be for you, but if you don't have a drum sander, you're probably gonna have to buy your pieces because there's really no other way to get them down to a 1/16 of an inch uniformly all the way across without a drum sander. Now, once you get your pieces cut and sanded, well, then you're going to have to cut what they call the fingers or the swallowtails. Now, I have found that I am not a fan of cutting them with a razor like a lot of folks do. And what they do is they put these in boiling water so that they're soft, and then they trim them, and then they trim them with a razor knife. The reason I'm not a big fan of that is when you do that, it's hard to get that rounded bottom like you see right there. And because if you get too much of a point, it tends to split really easy. So I find having a rounded finger or swallowtail is much better and much easier than it is with a sharp edge. Now, the easiest way to do this I have found is with a router. Small bit, cleaning it up, gives me nice clean edges, and I don't get that sharp point. 1/8 inch bit seems to work just fine. Now, once you've got one made, then you can use it as your template for adding on to others. You can just draw it out. I myself have done mine on the CNC. I find it a little bit easier, quicker, and I can do several at a time. Now, when you get this done, then you've got to make some jigs for these to go around. Now, I cut mine out on the CNC. You can cut these out by hand and sand them, but with this style jig and being that thick, I found it a lot easier to just make it out of ply, glue them together, and then clean them up and sand them. Now, once you've got one made, now you've got something for your bands to wrap around. Make sure that you mark so that basically every time you wrap one around, those fingers line up in the exact same spot every time. Now, you're also going to need to make some plugs. And the reason for the plugs is once you've wrapped it around that piece, then you want to put the plug top and bottom, let it dry overnight, so that basically it has air to go all the way through. So when you make your plugs, don't just make one set, make several, because generally when you make one of these boxes, you're going to want to make more than one at a time. So it's always best to make 3 or 4 extra sets. So now you've got a jig for your fingers or swallowtails, you've got a jig for your bands to wrap around, and you've got your plug so that you can put them in the box so that they can dry overnight. Now, probably the most important thing when it comes to these boxes that you cannot get anywhere else besides the Home Shop out of Michigan is those little copper tacks. Now, you would think those little copper tacks would be pretty easy to find. One place on the planet sells them, and it's called the Home Shop. And they're pretty unique when it comes to ordering these tacks. You can't just order them online or you have to actually call them. They will send you the tacks and you have to send them a check in order to pay for them. So you can't even pay for them up front. They are absolutely old school. You can find them online. You just can't actually purchase them online. Give Eric a call over there. He'll help you out. My favorite size tack that they use or sell is the 1.5 and the 2s. Those two I've been able to make just about every box that you see here, all the way down to the smaller ones. The teeniest of their tacks, they're just extremely difficult to use. Now I did try some tacks from Home Depot or Lowe's that obviously were way too big. You can see they split the wood. They really look like crap. They just don't look right. You've got to get those tacks from the home shop. Again, if you find another establishment that sells those tacks, let me know, because I have not been able to find them anywhere besides the home shop. So I want to get started here. I'm going to show you step by step how I'm doing this, but I wanted to explain what we're doing here. The other thing that I want to show you is the different pieces of machinery that I'm using to make these, and I had to come up with some way of boiling this. You can buy these copper bins, which aren't cheap, and they do work probably the best. But I thought, man, spending $400 or $500 to learn how to do this just wasn't what I wanted to do. So I started looking for ways of heating and boiling water that would fit something that long and large, and not use an absolute ton of water. Couldn't find anything, so I called my buddy Izzy Swan, and Izzy said goat waterer. So I got to looking at it, and I liked them, but I had to seal the edges up in order to make them work. So I found a pig waterer. Was absolutely perfect for what I needed, and it was only about $125, $150. And then I had to buy 2 propane heating elements, which were $21 from Walmart, I believe. I was able to put the whole system together for under $200, which was pretty reasonable, and Blondie didn't complain too much about that. So let's get started. I'll go through, show you some of the different things that I made specifically for this, and then we'll get to building a box. Now, my 2 favorite materials that I've found that bend easy, don't crack too easy, have been walnut and cherry. Maple's a little bit more difficult, but it will work as well. But these 2 I found turn out to be some of the nicest boxes that I make. Now, you can see that I made different sizes here, and you generally want to make these short enough so that they fit inside each other, almost like nesting dolls. But let's get started with just a regular piece of material. We'll resaw it, we'll drum sand it, we'll mark our swallowtails, drill our holes, and then we'll get to boiling. All right, now make sure that whatever piece of wood you pick out for this doesn't have some weird knots in it. The piece that I need is going to be out of the smaller side here, so I'm going to cut that knot out. But you can't have big knots or imperfections in the wood, because when you steam it or boil it and then bend it, it will just crack or give you a very weird shape. So make sure that you get all of those out. Safety first. Now we've got the width that we want. Now I'm going to resaw this into 3 different pieces so that we can drum sand it down to the thickness that we really want. That'll give us 3 even pieces, and then we can drum sand it down from there. Now, I know those are a little bigger than they really should be, and you may be able to get a little closer, but don't get too close, because if you go to sand it down and you still have rough spots in it, you're not going to be happy and you've just wasted a whole bunch of material. So let's get the drum sanding. All right, now since I'm doing a lidded box, I need an extra piece for the band that goes around the lid. You can also do just a wider piece and cut one of those off. I'm making more than one box, so it doesn't hurt to add an extra piece of material here. I only need these 2, so we'll go ahead and get started and get these down nice and smooth and try to get them down to about 1/16 of an inch. I could not possibly live without my drum sand. This is one of those machines you don't realize just how much you need one until you have one, and then there's no possible way you could live without it. All right, so we're at about 3:30 seconds right now. So we'll take it down another pass or 2. Now the grit that I use on my drum sander 99% of the time is 80 grit. I find that I really don't need much more than that. Right now we're at about 9/128, so I'm actually just going to leave that alone, run it through a second time on the same setting. I always like to kind of run it through a second time on the same setting, just to kind of get some more of those lines out. We'll do the other side. Voila, 1/16. See, 1/16 of an inch. Now the next thing I need to do is to put our fingers, or draw those fingers out, and I'm going to do it for both boards. And the reason I say that is, even though one of them is for the band and the other is for the body, well, I need that same finger for the band. Now you can make them narrower for the band, for the top if you want, but it's still basically the same shape. So we just run that through. And don't forget to mark the spots that you've got to drill out. You have to drill these out, because if you don't, you'll split that wood, even though that tack is super teeny. Now you can see we've got them all marked. We've got all of our points or our drill holes marked. And now I can cut that out with the bandsaw, or I can actually shape it a little bit easier by using a template guide and doing that on the router. Once you've got one done, it's pretty easy to do from that point. But we'll just go ahead and cut these out real quick, and then we'll drill our holes and we'll get to boiling. All right, so that I can save a little bit of time here, I'm going to cut them both at the same time, but it's hard to hold them and keep them from moving. So I'm just going to use a little bit of double stick tape. Only need a couple of pieces because it's just a temporary hold so that we can get this done. So we'll put one front and back. Make sure that we're even on the edge. Don't sweat it too much if you miss that line just a little bit. These are so thin, they're pretty easy to sand down. Like I said, they don't have to be perfect, because they're so easy to sand down to make that line. Now, before you take these apart, just clean those edges up a little bit there. But before you take these apart, make sure you drill your holes. That way you don't have to do it twice. Now, these don't have to be perfect, but you do want them as clean as possible this way. This way isn't quite so much. And the reason I say that, it looks a little better if it's perfectly in line. Now, I know you're probably wondering, why do I have such a thick piece of wood? Well, that's because when you have a thinner piece, it's hard to get those fingers up underneath so that I can hold it down. These are such thin pieces that if you don't kind of apply that angled pressure, it's difficult at best to keep it from popping up, and it could crack it. But now we've got all of our holes drilled, we've got it cut out. The last thing we need to do is kind of thin this end of our board so that when we wrap it around, we don't have such a blunt edge going against the side. All right, now I just want to thin those edges on both ends, just again, so that when it wraps around, it's a little bit more tapered. Doesn't take a whole lot. One more. Now, something else I like to do, since this edge can be a little bit rough, just round those over just a little bit there, so that we're working with a nice smooth edge. Now we can trim this cap piece down so that we've got our band for it. We're ready to boil. Now, like I said, we only need one of these for our cap piece, so we need to trim these off. I will tell you that when it comes to fences like this, it's difficult to keep a thin piece like this from going up underneath. So for this, I'm going to use the mag fence. Really important to keep it from going up underneath of the fence. Since it's magnetically held down, it can't get up underneath that fence. Now, you'll notice that I'm putting my fingers underneath, my thumb on top, and I'm pressing down. That way, it's easier to keep control of. Now we've got 3 bands so that we can make extra boxes. That way when we make our band for the bodies, we've got a couple of extras for the next time. All right, everybody, smells like soup is on. We've got some boiling water. Set this off to the side. We're gonna put our band in there and our body band. Get you a pair of tongs to kind of move things around. One does not pick up tongs without clicking them together like a lobster. We'll cover that up. We'll set a timer for 20 minutes, and then we're going to bend our piece and put it together. All right, so in order to put our pieces together with our tacks, you're going to have to make some sort of a anvil to actually pound your tacks into place. Now, I just use a piece of fence piping. I bolted it to a couple of pieces of 2x4. You can put that in a vise. I'm going to actually clamp it right to my table. That way I've got something to flatten those tacks out with. If you don't have one of these, even just a simple piece of pipe clamped to the table will work. All right, now it's been boiling for about 20 minutes. Take our tongs. We're going to pull this out and wrap it around our form. All right, now they'll tell you to use some gloves, but after about 10 seconds, it really does not stay hot enough to worry too much about it. I've got my mark on my form so that I can make sure that my fingers end up in the same spot every time. We're going to wrap that right around that form. Now, you want to be careful when you're wrapping this that you wrap the whole piece. Don't let go of one of those little fingers, because if you do, it'll spring and split on you. So we'll just bring that back. Make sure everything's lined up as close as possible. Sure everything's as tight as possible. We're not too concerned with it being perfect all the way around, as close as possible. And the reason being is we're going to actually take it out of this mold, and then we're going to actually put our tacks in with our anvil. So we're just going to let that set. We'll just let it set for about a minute or so. Flip it over there on those fingers. just so that I've got a helping hand here, just gonna scoot that over so that I can grip that piece. That way it'll sit there, and I'm going to get my anvil set up. Now these little tacks, they are sharp as they can be, and they will stick you. So be very careful when you're grabbing them. And, I mean, you can see it, just touch them and they'll stick in your fingers. So be very careful, but get a few out so that they're readily available to you. Now this is sat about a minute or so. So what we want to do, we'll reclamp that by hand. And I'm just going to mark where our fingers go. That way when I take this out, you can see it's already kind of assumed that shape, but we've also got some marks in the wood so we know exactly where to replace it. We're going to do that. And again, make sure that you're holding all three of those fingers, because if it splits on you, well, you've wasted a little bit of time. So now I've got my fingers lined up on those marks. I'm going to take one of my tacks, just press that right into place. We'll pound that in. Now make sure that you keep pressure on all of these fingers until you've got it all the way across. One more. Now we can relax a little bit and get the rest of those tacks into place. So when you put that tack in, try to make sure that it's perfectly straight up and down. That way when you drive that into the anvil, it bends and feathers that piece or flattens it. You'll notice when I put these in, I'm making sure they're straight up and down. That way it kind of mushrooms that point into the anvil. Now these are number 2 tacks that I'm using. Go back and make sure they're all flattened and good. Now you can see this one kind of angled on me. So what I'm going to do, just pop that one back out. You can see that when it went in, it actually turned to the side. It didn't flatten out. That's okay. Just pull that out. We'll realign it straight. So that now it ends up nice and flat. All right, so next we're gonna take our plugs, and when we put these in, we want it to fit really snug and tight. Want to hear that crunch sound, basically. That way, as they dry, they'll take that shape. But now we've got our plugs in, but we don't have that whole thick piece in there so that it won't dry properly, and we'll let that sit overnight. But before we do that, we need to form our cap as well. Now we want our lid to go over this, so we're gonna actually lay that finger right in place and go right around the box . That way we know it's the same size as the outside of our box. We'll make sure we mark that again. Let it set. That way it starts to take shape. Should be about long enough. Line that up with our mark. And we'll repeat the process of those tacks. Again, make sure it's straight up and down so that you're mushrooming that point. Now, slide that back over. We want that as tight as possible so that, again, it takes the shape of the box itself. You want to hear that crunching sound, for lack of a better word. Just use our other piece. Wanting to catch on our tacks there. Now, these things are a lot tougher than you think they are. So don't be afraid to work them a little bit. But now we've got our plugs in there, we've got our cap in place. Now we'll let that dry overnight so that basically we're ready to assemble this. All right, so we've let the box dry. Now we're just gonna pull those plugs out, and as you can see, they're not the easiest thing to remove. That's why you want to put holes in here so that it is easier to pop out. Now we'll take our cap off. We've got a shaped piece. The last thing that we've got to do is cut our top and bottom. Now, I will tell you, when it comes to cutting these, make sure that when you draw this into place, draw the inside and the outside of that piece. The reason you want to do that is if you get just a little bit too small, you got to start all over again. Because what happens is you want to stretch this over that piece so that there's very little or no gaps. So what I've done here is I've actually drawn the inside and the outside of the piece, and we'll hold this up close so you can see my lines. That way I'm going to cut the outside line and then I'm going to sand it as close to the inside line. That way I get it as close to that shape as possible. So now I'm going to cut that outside line. Remember, when you're cutting this, it doesn't have to be perfect, but be sure that you cut outside the line, not inside, so that you don't get too close. But if you do get too close, just remember you're going to use it for a smaller box. Don't toss it. So now we'll take this to the sander and sand it down to the proper line. That way we try to make it fit as tight as possible. And we'll take our piece into the sander with us so that we can check it periodically. Now there's kind of a trick to sanding with this type of sander. Not put pressure this way. You want to hold the pressure so that it pulls it. Because if you push it into it, it's going to shoot that piece right off the table. All right, now you can see I've gotten it fairly close to that line, and we'll just set that piece in, see just how close we are. Seems to be snug. You can see it pulls everything in. If you get it too loose, then you're going to have a bunch of gaps all the way around. You want it as snug as possible. That looks pretty good. But you can see that that piece wants to be as tight as possible. We'll just drop that into place. See, by stretching it around that, you have little or no gaps in that piece. That way, it takes that exact same shape. Now, in order to hold this into place, I've made another jig, which you don't have to make, but it makes it a lot easier to put these into place. All right, now the way that I hold these pieces into place is with a toothpick. All I'm doing is I'm cutting these into about 1/2-inch pieces. As you can see, I've got several cut right here. And I'm using an old drill that I used to use a good bit, and it's kind of worn out. You can see the cord's messed up, but I've cut it so that basically this piece will drill right in there, perfect every time, the exact same height. Now you can make your own, or you can just simply set a lip and put your box next to it and drill in so that you get the exact same height every time. I found this to be very simple to use. Now I'm going to hold those toothpicks in with good old Titebond Instabond. Instabond is great stuff. I use just the medium here. And to make it a little bit easier so I'm not picking up the bottle every time, just put a drop or two in just a little piece that I've got. First thing we need to do is drill those out. Now, try to avoid the ends. And the reason being is that's kind of your most stressed point because of the sharpest edge. So I'm going to put 4 in each one of these. I simply hold down. I made it to where all I've got to do is turn that. Hold down. So I've simply drilled right in there. We'll take each one of those little toothpicks, just dip it in a little bit of the Instabond, just put that right in place. Do the same thing to the other 3. Doesn't take much, just want enough so that it can't work its way back out. And now we've got that bottom in place. Let's do the same thing to the top. And again, we want to avoid those ends. Now we'll clip those off. We'll sand them. And we're just about there. Now you don't want to get too aggressive because remember, you're only working with a 1/16 of an inch. We'll use a little bit of hand sanding on this. We're just about done. We'll finish this up. All right, now I've got one sanded up here and finished, and you can see the fingers are basically all the exact same direction, both lid and body. Now on the piece that I did on the video here, you can see I put the lid on the wrong side, so the finger is going the wrong way. Make sure you don't do that. I've done that a couple of times just because I kind of get into a hurry. And not many people are really going to notice that, but you know as well as I do, as my buddy Jim Heavey has always taught me, when someone says your work is beautiful, say thank you and shut up. Now, I hope you all enjoyed this project. I've had a ball making these, and it just kind of is perfect in my wheelhouse because it has to do with resawing. So, if you have any other questions, please put them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so that you're notified every time we come out with a new video. Y'all, thank you so much for watching.